Hi, everyone. Welcome to our third lecture on the Cold War. Just a reminder, if you have any questions, please let me know or check in with me during Zoom, email, remind, all of those good things. As we continue to go through this term, things are going to change rapidly, and you might be good one day, and then the next day you might need something. So please make sure that you reach out if you need anything. All right, let's get into it. All right, so the Red Scare. So we talked about this in our last lecture, but just a reminder, we have a first Red Scare in the early 1900s, about 1920. And then we are talking about the second Red Scare, and this is after World War II. And we see that the US and the Soviet Union are the two superpowers. So they're the ones that are essentially vying for world domination. Okay? So this second Red Scare, or Cold War, I should say, is going to help start a longer, more intense Red Scare. So if you have a Cold War that's like this challenge between the two superpowers, it's the Red Scare, which is this fear of communism that many Americans are going to have. Okay? And those international events that we kind of talked about the last time are going to help fuel or make the Red Scare, the second Red Scare, as large as it possibly is. One of the things that I didn't do a good job of mentioning last time, but the Soviet Union is not doing a very good job of allowing free elections in Eastern Europe after the war. So there are some very warranted, heavy criticism of the Soviets doing in their bloc. We talked about the Berlin blockade last time, and I mentioned at the very end the fall of China. And the fall of China to communism is, again, very, very important because at that moment, it now seems like there are more people under communist leadership or ideology than under democracy or in the United States sphere of influence. So at that moment, those numbers look about 345 under the American sphere or democracy versus 555 that are under some sort of communist leadership. And for Americans, that's really scary. That looks like the potential for even America to fall to communism. So they start to really get worried about these things. And you can kind of see that in this poster over here. Is this tomorrow? America under communism. So kind of that fear that this is what's to come. All right, so just a couple of reminders. Our first term together, we talked about the Great Depression. And during the Great Depression, you see a lot of people flirt with communism or more radical ideas. It's not uncommon, and that's because in the middle of Great Depression, where you have something like 1/4 of people that are out of a job, they have questions about how capitalism works and if capitalism is the answer. So they start to explore other things. This is going to be problematic or come back to haunt some of them because those records or that membership in the Communist Party is going to be used against them at this time. However, the other things we want to make sure that we remember is that the ideology of communism is separate than support for the Soviet Union or dictatorship. So some people might be interested or find value in something like communism or socialism, but not support the Stalins of the world or the Maos of the world or any sort of dictatorship. This would work the same in the United States. You might really appreciate or find value in democracy, but not like the leader of the country. And so there is some separation between those things that often gets lost in this sort of a conversation. The other thing is, historically, we're in the early 1950s. And so World War II is only 5 years behind us, 6 years behind us. And what we're seeing is that support for the Soviet Union, which has been our ally in World War II, is now seen as repulsive or terrible. And this really quick switch of, we were talking about like pro-Soviet or pro-Russian propaganda or things in the war, and now it's like absolutely nothing. They're evil. We don't want anything to do with them. So that switch is happening. All right, so this Red Scare is going to take over in the United States. And there's going to be a lot of domestic events that are going to help fuel that, not just those international things like we saw in the last couple slides. We're going to see some pretty large-scale spy cases, so people are going to be really fascinated by that. And one of the things that we're going to see is that Richard Nixon, who will become vice president under Eisenhower and then president all by himself, is going to be very much involved in those spy cases in his early days in Congress. He's very concerned about rooting out communists and kicking them out of America or the American government. Alger Hiss is going to be the most famous, I shouldn't say most famous, but one of the major cases during that time. And we're going to get to that in a couple slides. And then for us, it's going to be really important to understand this thing called the House Un-American Activities Committee. So this is part of Congress, it's part of the House, and they are investigating citizens to see if they are disloyal to the United States or connected to communism. It actually starts even prior to World War II, but they're going to really be active in the in the 1940s and the early 1950s. They're going to be really important because they are calling people to testify or making accusations against people without evidence. It's really just these tactics of saying, oh, you might be connected to this thing, or you might be connected to this. And it's going to absolutely ruin people's careers because it's not based off of evidence, it's based off of these accusations. And the other thing is, people are throwing their friends and their neighbors under the bus, or people that they don't like. They're like, I'm not a communist, but this guy over here is a communist. And that's going to have lots and lots of consequences for people. And one of the groups that we see have that consequence is what's known as the Hollywood Blacklist. And they're a group of directors and producers and writers that are trying to fight back against the government and this wild thing of making accusations and ruining people's reputation in America, who supposedly believes in people's innocence until proven guilty. And so they're going to refuse to testify. And one of the things that they're really upset about is this idea that in our First Amendment, one of the things that we have is the freedom of association. So if you want to join a communist party or you want to join a more radical group, the Constitution gives you the power to do that or the right to do that. And this House Un-American Activities Committee and the Red Scare is seemingly violating that protection, that right that we as Americans have to explore or to associate with people. Okay? That's going to have consequences. There's a group called the Hollywood 10, who's really this blacklisted group, and many of them are never going to be able to work in Hollywood again. Many of them flee the country, or once they flee the country, write under pseudonyms or fake names. And so it has lots of consequences. This is going to be a famous group of people that have that, but lots of Americans are going to be blacklisted and unable to work or unable to repair their reputation. So Arthur Miller is on here. He was a playwright and an author at that time, pretty dang famous, and he actually wrote The Crucible, which on the surface is about the Salem witch trials. So another witch hunt, another use of wild accusations without evidence to ruin people's career or cost them their lives. And even though The Crucible is about the witch hunt, he's really talking about HUAC and the Red Scare. And he's doing this because he feels it's wrong. It's also a lot of his friends and his colleagues that are getting in trouble with this. Just kind of a fun fact at that moment, it says that he's married to NN at that time. And that NN is actually Marilyn Monroe, so the famous actress. All right, so besides HUAC, one of the things that we see Congress do, or I should say Truman do, is what's known as the Federal Employee Loyalty Review Program. And this is essentially that federal employees have to prove that they are loyal to the government or the country, essentially that they're not communists. Truman's in a tough spot. He wants to make sure that he looks tough on communism, but he doesn't want to give into too much of this fear-mongering. So to him, this is a compromise. This is his way of saying, hey, look, I'm doing something about this, but not eroding people's rights too much. We could definitely argue about whether this is an appropriate compromise, an effective compromise, but it's what Truman chooses to do. And this loyalty review program actually never finds any communists. There's never anybody that is removed, essentially, from the government with this program. All right, so this is one of the most infamous of those spy cases. So this guy right here, this is Whittaker Chambers. And Whittaker Chambers had been a member of the Communist Party, and he'd actually been a spy. He'd been giving information to the Soviet Union. But he is going to change his mind and decide that he doesn't want to do that. So he's going to quit the Communist Party. He's going to quit being a spy. He's actually going to work for Time magazine. So he gets subpoenaed or brought forward in front of HUAC, and he's going to claim this guy, Alger Hiss, was a spy, that they had been working together. So he's a communist and a spy. that was trying to help the Soviet Union. That is a really big deal because Alger Hiss was a member of the State Department. He'd worked for the FDR administration, for the Truman administration, and he was one of the architects of things like the United Nations. So really big deal, really high up in the federal government. Okay? So Hiss is not going to be happy that Whittaker Chambers is making these accusations. So he's going to sue for what is known as slander. So essentially dirtying his name. Right? However, this is going to draw the attention of Nixon, again, the guy that's going to become vice president, and HUAC. So they start to investigate. Nixon's like actually on vacation, and he comes home early to start working on this. So there's this back and forth between these men about what it is that happened or what Alger Hiss was doing. And Whittaker Chambers comes up with this crazy thing. He says, I have proof that Alger Hiss was a spy. It's on my property. Come look at it. And so Nixon and some people trudge to his house, and the evidence that he has is hidden in a pumpkin, a real live pumpkin that he hid evidence in, which is a very, very strange thing. Sometimes fact is stranger than fiction. And so what that evidence is enough for is to show that Alger Hiss committed perjury. So he lied under oath. Too much time has gone by, supposedly, to get him for espionage, or there's not quite enough to get him on espionage or working with the Soviet Union, but enough to get him on perjury. He is going to swear to the day he dies that he is innocent, that he did not do this, that he did not spy for the Soviet Union. However, now we likely have enough evidence to show that he absolutely worked for the Soviet Union as a spy. But at this time, legally, he is only charged with perjury. Okay, so go away thing. Oh, that's not what I wanted. Let's try and fix that. Okay. So there's this thing that we saw for a quick second over here that talks about treason, okay, essentially betraying your country. Even though people are going to say he committed treason, he's not convicted of that. No court of law says that he committed treason. They only, at that moment, find him guilty of perjury, so lying under oath. Now it's more complicated, but in a court of law, he is not found guilty of treason. All right, so the Red Scare is going to continue. I'm going to move myself out of the way. There's a lot of fear growing. Questions about, are you a communist? Is your neighbor a communist? And really all these wild accusations, he said, she said, stuff kind of being thrown around. So China's fall, which we've talked about a couple times, and Alger Hiss's perjury conviction is going to cause some pretty loud criticism of the Democratic Party by Republicans, right? And criticisms of Truman. It's going to get a lot louder. So Truman is really feeling the pressure at this moment. The other thing is it's not just the Republican Party. We also see some media moguls, okay? One from Time magazine and from Hearst magazine, or Enterprise, essentially. And they are going to finance and publicize religious revivals of a really famous man named Billy Graham, who I should have a picture of up here, but I don't, so I apologize. And his sermons or his speeches are going to be fiery anti-communist events. And they're going to gain a lot of mass attention. Millions of people are going to start paying attention to Billy Graham's sermons and things. So what we see is that these entrepreneurs, these massive media people, are going to use religion, with Billy Graham's help, to make a strong connection between religion and capitalism. So people's faith and their pocketbooks. And so this is a very complicated and now convoluted thing that we see happen. And there's a conscious reason that these entrepreneurs or these financiers or big companies are trying to connect those things. And we're going to see that as we move forward. Congress is more than happy to keep going with this. And so we're going to see that they pass two acts in the middle of the Red Scare. Number one, the Smith Act. You can't call for or be part of a group advocating the overthrowing of government. which is a complicated way of saying that you can't be a communist. I'm not sure that those essentially go hand in hand together, but that's how Congress is interpreting what it means to be a communist and how they write that law. That's going to get challenged. It's going to go all the way to the Supreme Court in a case called Dennis versus the United States. And it's essentially going to say, or the Supreme Court is going to decide that the Smith Act is constitutional. And this is another moment where we see that they choose safety or security over free speech. So once again, the Supreme Court is willing to limit our rights or our freedoms as individuals in order to protect the safety or the security of the whole. And these are things that we've seen in almost every wartime that the Supreme Court and the government has done. And I just said wartime. And so this is another interesting thing to think about. While we call it a Cold War, we are not actually at war. We're not in a military conflict with anybody at this moment. But people are so afraid of the potential of the Soviet Union or the potential for communism to take over in the United States that they treat it as if we are in a war. Okay. All right, the second act is the McCarran Act. And it says that communists must register, limit immigration, gives the government power to deport people. Truman is going to say that this act is going too far. Again, it's eroding some of those constitutional rights that we have. This idea that we would have to register if you were a communist, or American citizens would have to register, sounds a lot like maybe what Germany was doing prior to the Holocaust, or as we're building up to the Holocaust, or what the United States did to Japanese Americans or Japanese immigrants in World War II. So this idea of labeling people or forcing people to register raises a lot of red flags. Unfortunately, Congress is going to override his veto. So even though Truman doesn't like this, Congress has the numbers and the power to override that. Okay? So again, Congress is choosing, just like we saw the Supreme Court do, security over freedom. Okay? Later, they'll make some adjustments to this. They'll say it's not about individuals, but that the party has to register, meaning the Communist Party would have to register with the government. So again, some changes, but overall you're seeing that the federal government, all parts of the federal government are putting safety or security over individual rights. All right, then there's this man right here. So he is going to haunt us essentially this entire term. And this man right here is J. Edgar Hoover. He is the man that is pretty instrumental in the first Red Scare. And then pretty soon after the end of the first Red Scare, he is going to be in charge of the brand new FBI. And he will be the director of the FBI's from the 1920s until it starts, until the 1970s when he dies. He is a fascinating, interesting man. He is going to have the FBI do what he calls these counterintelligence programs or missions. He's going to say that his FBI, so his Federal Bureau of Investigation, is going to investigate anybody who might be connected to communism or is a communist. He's protecting the safety of America. But really, what he does is he goes after anyone he doesn't like, anybody that is seen as radical or would question him. And that is a large group of people. His first target or enemy is going to be the Communist Party, but it's anybody that he thinks is radical or would question the status quo in the United States. And we'll see that the longer he's in office, the more people he targets in that. It's pretty vile and large violations of people's rights. Things like breaking into people's homes, looking at their mail, making anonymous phone calls, infiltrating their organizations, and so all these sort of things. He is so powerful and he has dirt on so many people that while he's in office, there's no oversight on the FBI, no regulation on what it is that they're doing. And again, he has so many secrets that he is more powerful than members of Congress or the president. They don't question what the FBI does, and he doesn't lose his job. The FBI is only investigated and regulated after he dies. So he is an incredible person. So some of those famous spy cases, besides Alger Hiss, we get some of these guys. All right, so this is Fuchs, and he is arrested in connection to giving atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. He is going to admit to his actions, and he is going to throw some of his friends under the bus. So he's going to throw Greenglass, Gold, and Rosenbergs under the bus. So I'm not really going to talk about Gold. You can look him up if you're interested. But this guy right here is Greenglass. Greenglass was actually recruited by this guy, Julius Rosenberg. When he is caught or brought to trial, he's going to throw them under the bus. And that is a big deal because this woman right here is his sister. So he's going to throw his sister and his brother-in-law under the bus, right, and connect them to espionage or spying in order to protect himself and his kids, which is kind of a crazy thing. All right, so these two are also going to be brought to trial, okay, to their connection to espionage. We know Julius at this point is guilty, and we know that he was kind of the ringleader to these things. Her guilt is less clear. Okay? We knew, or they knew at that moment in time, that she was probably aware of what was happening and she might have helped tighten some things up. But her actual participation in this spy ring is way less clear. But it doesn't matter. They're both executed. So they're the first couple to be executed for conspiracy to commit espionage. Okay? There are some other spy things. There's some links on the bottom of this PowerPoint. I don't know if I have it later in there, but there's also some cases about recent spies in the United States, particularly some from China in the last couple of months. So if it's not hyperlinked below, you might look that up. I don't know, what does spying look like in 2020? All right, this guy right here is not a spy, but he, I think, is one of the most interesting stories, or kind of connects a lot of things in history. So Abe Maripol had actually been a communist earlier in his life, but he is a Jewish teacher in New York City, and he and his wife cannot have children. So they adopt these two boys. Any guesses on who these two boys are? Go back one slide. Julius and Ethel have two boys. And when they are executed, somebody needs to adopt them. And they sure as heck are not going to this jerk right here, okay? Or his wife. So these two boys need to be adopted. Abe Maripol and his wife are going to adopt these two boys. But the reason that this is an even crazier story is he meets these two boys at W.E.B. Du Bois's Christmas party. So somebody that we spend a lot of time talking about in our first term together, and is super crucial to civil rights or civil liberties in the United States, is going to help connect these two boys. But it's an even more interesting story because Abe Maripol writes this song. And he writes this song called Strange Fruit, which is made famous by Billie Holiday. And this song, Strange Fruit, goes, strange fruit hanging in the poplar trees, black bodies swinging in the breeze. And so it's this incredibly haunting song about lynching in the United States that's written by this man, but made famous by this woman. And if you have not heard this song, I really challenge you to go take a look at it. It's pretty amazing. You might also have heard part of it in a Kanye song. I think there's 2 Kanye songs that he samples it. There's also this podcast. Because while she is an amazing singer, this song actually gets her in trouble. The government does not appreciate that she is singing this song about lynching. And she is one of the first victims of the war on drugs. She has a very, very hard life and uses drugs to cope with that. So they're going to go after her. But she is unafraid of that. And she will continue to sing this song and to get this message out there about the terribleness that is lynching. So we really encourage you to check out what Billie Holiday is doing. Okay. All right. So then we get the Korean War. And so this is actually not a war. The last time the United States actually officially declared war, that takes Congress to do that, was World War II. But this is what we commonly refer to as the Korean War or police action. Okay? All right. So this picture right here I have up here before I'm telling you what happened shows both African Americans and American or white Americans fighting in Korea. And it's important to point that out because this is after Truman's executive order that desegregates the military. And so this is the first time that we don't see segregated units fighting. We see integrated units that are fighting. So this is a major change. All right, so Korean War. What we see is that after World War II, we're going to divide. Actually, I'll use this one right here. We are going to create a temporary divide of Korea. So South Korea, North Korea. South Korea is going to fall under the American sphere of influence, and North Korea is going to be under the Soviet sphere of influence. Syngman Rhee is going to be, this is Syngman Rhee. This is going to be the person that the United States backed. We're hoping that he's going to be essentially a puppet that we can control. Instead, he turns out to be an evil dictator that kills over 100,000 people. Okay. In the North, we have this guy right here, Kim Il-sung. So he's actually the current dictator's grandfather. Both of these men are not great leaders for their people, but both of them hope that they're going to be able to reunify under a single government. Of course, Syngman Rhee is going to want it under his government, and Il-sung is going to want, or Kim Il-sung is going to want it under his government. And I'll just pause one more second. The reason that we see this temporary divide is, again, because FDR begged the Soviet Union to get involved. And so this is ultimately going to be begged the Soviet Union to get involved in the Pacific, so in Asia, for World War II. And so this is kind of the consequence of that. Okay. All right, and the last thing I'll point out before we move on is this is a current picture of Korea. So this is North Korea, and this is South Korea. And we can see a really big difference. This part, so North Korea, you can see there are almost no lights except for the capital right here, where there's all these lights over here. This is called a hermit nation. They essentially are isolated from the rest of the world. No information in, no information out. And so you can see kind of the consequences of that. All right. So I'm going to refer to this kind of as Douglas MacArthur's war. So this guy right here is put in charge of the troops in the Korean War, and that's going to have consequences. All right, so don't you love this lovely map that I have for you? You can tell this is something that we would have done in class together, but, it's not what we're doing today. But I'm going to use it to kind of explain to you briefly what happened in the war. All right, so like I just mentioned, post-World War II, you see that divide at the 38th. Okay, so this is China up here, this is North Korea, and then this is South Korea. And so you can see the capital of South Korea right there. Okay. All right. So North Korea, communist leadership, they are going to decide that they are going to invade South Korea. Okay. So we're going to see early on, they're going to go past that line and they are going to capture the capital of Seoul. By the end of July, so just a month into it, they've captured everything except for this little tiny place that's known as Pusan. Okay? So that is not going to work for the Americans or for the UN. Okay, so what we see is that the UN, with lots of American leadership, is going to call for military forces. They're going to order that. So it's going to be this police action. Over here, it says that the Soviet Union was not present. And that's because the Soviet Union in the UN actually has the ability to veto action, but they're protesting something else that day, so they're actually not there to protest what the UN decides to do. Right? So the UN, lots of American leadership, is going to come to Korea to try and solve this, or to stop the communist North Koreans. And it's going to be this guy, Douglas MacArthur, that they're going to put in charge of the UN troops. And he is a big deal. He served in World War II. He was in charge of part of the Pacific in World War II. We talked about him with the Philippines. And he actually has not been to the United States in like a decade and a half when this is happening. So even though he's this incredible incredible is maybe not the right word, but very famous military leader. He's been away for a long time. Because I forgot to tell you, he, after serving World War II, he is essentially put in charge of Japan, or rebuilding Japan after the war. So he's in close proximity to Korea for them to send during this conflict. Okay. All right, so let's see what it's going to do. So we come over here. MacArthur does sometimes have some good ideas, and he's going to say, hey, we're stuck here. We could go this direction, but maybe that's not the best thing to do. So what he decides to do is for the troops to go from Busan and do what's known as the Incheon landing. So we're going to go around, actually, and land over here. And that's pretty dang successful. They're going to win all of this back, the UN and South Korea. And then they're going to get to this 38th parallel. And they have to answer a question. Remember, this is the time of Truman's containment. So to contain communism where it was. So to contain it like it was. Or do we keep going? And they're going to decide, to heck with containment, we're going to keep going. We're going to try and push communism out of Korea. Okay? So they're going to keep going. They want it all. And so by the fall, the only thing that North Korea has under their control are these little tiny spots. But then we got a problem. Okay? So what's going to happen is that the communists in China are going to join the war on the side of the North Koreans. So you're going to have a massive influx of Chinese troops into North Korea to try and beat back the UN and the American forces. Okay? So when that happens, MacArthur had promised that this wouldn't happen, or that the Chinese forces would not be effective fighters. Essentially, we don't need to worry about them. He did not take into effect how many people there were that would participate, or the Chinese had just finished fighting a civil war. So they've had lots of practice with fighting in the recent past. So he really underestimated what they are capable for. Okay? But they have to answer a question. Do we widen this war? Do we also fight this war against China, not just against the North Koreans? What do we do? MacArthur has some wild ideas. He wants to call in the nationalists, so the government that we recognize as the government of China that's in Taiwan, little island. Do we call them in this fight? But the reason, or the crazy thing that MacArthur thinks we should do is that we should, use an atomic bomb on China, and that's how we're going to end this. Truman does not like that idea. Truman's like, whoa. We just used 2 nuclear bombs in 5 years ago. We don't need to do this again. We don't need to go that direction. And so you're going to set off this fight between MacArthur, the general, and the president of the United States. And that does not go over well. So another word for the president of the United States is the commander-in-chief. And so he's the top person that's also in charge of the military. So technically MacArthur's boss. And as MacArthur's boss, he's saying, stop, we're not using nuclear weapons, we're not going to invade China, we're done, we're not doing any of those things. MacArthur does not like that answer. So MacArthur is actually going to try and go around the president, he's going to talk to the media, he's going to talk to Congress to get support for this. Unfortunately, you are not supposed to question your boss like that, particularly the president of the United States. And so Truman will fire MacArthur. It's actually very, very very criticized or unliked. Again, MacArthur had been this World War II hero. People loved him. And so when Truman fires him, people are very, very unhappy. But historically, looking back, we can see that this was probably the good answer, or the better of the options at that moment in time. So MacArthur's out. General Ridgway is going to come in, and he's going to be pretty successful, at least of pushing back the North Koreans. So we're going to get a stalemate. They're going to spend about 2 years fighting over a little bit of land and what we do with prisoners of war. So ultimately, this war does not end until 1953. The reason that is important is that Eisenhower is actually the president when this ends. So even though it starts under Truman, Truman unfortunately is very unpopular with this war, and so he will not win re-election, or he doesn't run. And I'm sorry, I'll get to that in just a second. But it's going to be Eisenhower that is actually the president when this thing is over. And the last thing I'll point out is it would be easy to say that this seems like a ridiculous or silly war, because again, The only thing that changes is this line changes slightly. We go from the 38th to what's known as the demilitarized zone, which is still there today. But if we go back, we look at this. Here is that demilitarized zone, the difference between those two. This is the North Korean regime, the communist regime. And you can see that they don't have any of those innovations or life like we see in South Korea. So one of the more positive ways to look at this is this is what we protected. By containing communism, not allowing it to spread or take over in South Korea, we protected this. And then any of my K-pop fans, you might be very appreciative of the fact that we made sure that we as the United States and the UN made sure that not the entire place fell to communism. All right. Just to kind of show you what an unpopular war this is, this right here is a Purple Heart. So something that people, it's one of the highest honors you can win in service. Okay. And there's this letter right here. And this is a letter that somebody sent to Truman. And he returns his dead son's Purple Heart to Truman for what he calls Truman's trophy room. And he says his only regret is that Truman's daughter did not receive the same treatment in Korea. So his only regret is that Truman's daughter didn't die in North Korea. And so this is probably an extreme letter, but it shows how angry people are or how upset they are that they are fighting in Korea. All right. So you guys might have seen this movie or at least heard of this movie. North Korea's dislike for the United States and vice versa has never stopped. And so in the 2000s, we see the creation of this movie called The Interview. It's a really silly, stupid comedy where these guys are supposed to go to North Korea and execute or kill the dictator. So we know this is a silly, stupid comedy. But North Korea took this very, very serious, the fact that we would make this film about their leader. And so their response to that is that they hacked Sony. So a large conversation about what do you do with this? Because one of the things they said could happen is harm to people who want to go see the movies. And so this is also where you see a private company get involved with the American government as well. Decisions about, do you open this movie? Do you release this to theaters? Do you put people in potentially harm's way or not? And one of the reasons that the government got involved is they did not want us to seem weak, for lack of better words, that we would give into North Korean fear or threats. And so what we did see is that it opened to some movies, but it also opened to stream, so you could stream it online. Again, not the highest quality of movie. It's really ridiculous. Pretty dang inappropriate. So it's not something that I would show you or ever give you extra credit for. I don't know. But if for some reason that's your jam, go for it. All right. And then, of course, not over. We now have some interesting, I don't even know what to say, changes in our relationship with North Korea. And so we go from a couple of years ago, Donald Trump saying the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un just stated that the nuclear button is on his desk at all times. Will someone from his depleted and food-starved regime please inform him that I too have a nuclear button? But it is a much bigger and more powerful one than his, and my button works. So essentially the threats between these two leaders, for a while, North Korea was referring to the president as a dotard, and lots of other fun, exciting things. But instead, we see some summits between these two leaders, which has never happened. So that's definitely an advancement in the relationship between these two leaders. Supposedly, this was going to lead to denuclearization or North Korea stopping to develop nuclear weapons. But we never actually see an official deal. And satellite image shows that that has not actually happened. There are also supposed to be some sanctions that happen, but as we can see from these lovely tweets, not so much. So some strange things in developments in our relationship with North Korea in the last couple of years. All right, but back to the 1950s, we get this lovely gentleman, we say with sarcasm, and this is Joseph McCarthy. So he is a first-term Republican senator from Wisconsin, and he won, or I'm sorry, he doesn't win. He's hoping to win re-election in 1952. And he's really thinking, right, I've been in the Senate for so long, I haven't really made a name for myself. How do I make sure that people know who I am and to vote for me? Essentially, how do I maintain power? And he says, I know what I do. I'll investigate communism. I think Joseph McCarthy is one of the biggest evil people in American history, for lack of better words. I mean, you can kind of see that early on in his career or his life. He joins World War II. He fights in World War II, not because he believes this is a good war and you should defeat the Nazis or anything of that, but for his own personal benefit. And it's not like we might say today, like you might join the military to get them to pay for college or to make something of yourself. He does it because he knows that he wants to be a politician, and he knows that he's more likely to be elected if he serves. So it's for his personal benefit, and his actions are for his personal benefit, often at the expense of others. And it's not about either bettering society or serving your country, but how do you gain power for yourself, and kind of how do you hold that power over others, which I think makes it very different than some other people. All right, so Mr. McCarthy. The thing that's going to put Mr. McCarthy on the stage is going to be the speech that he gives. So he gets asked to give this speech in West Virginia. This is not a speech that most Republicans want to give. It's kind of okay, you're a low man on the totem pole, go give this speech. So he does. And they do not anticipate that this is going to be one of the most infamous speeches in all of American history. So again, you guys know I love documents. We obviously are not going to read the whole thing. I'm just going to point out some of the things that he says in this speech. All right. So he says, and he's talking about the Cold War. This is not the usual war between nations for land areas or other material gains, but a war between two absolutely opposed ideologies. The great difference between our Western Christian world and our atheistic communist world is not political, gentlemen, it's moral. Today, we are engaged in a showdown between a democratic Christian world and a communistic atheist world. And I want to point that out because he's connecting political ideology with religious ideology. And he's saying that those things have to go together, and that one is good and one is bad. So Christianity is good, communism is bad, or atheism is bad. And I point that out because we've talked a lot about the First Amendment. And the First Amendment says that you have the freedom to believe in whatever it is that you want, or to not to believe. But he's connecting those to things. And he does not think that those things are equal in the United States. The other thing is he's talking about this as a moral war. And we know from our last lecture that this is not a moral war. It's about power, about world domination, or to be that superpower. So it's about the United States wanting to be that number one, and the Soviet Union also wanting to be that number one. All right. So, and then he goes on to talk about that population change, where there are more people under communist leadership at that moment. And he says, this indicates the swiftness of the tempo of communist victories and American defeats in the Cold War. As one of our outstanding historical figures once said, when a great democracy is destroyed, it will not be from enemies from without, but rather because of enemies within. So he's warning that what's actually the most dangerous part of this is that there are people within the United States that want to cause harm to America. So fellow American citizens or spies that want to cause harm. And then he goes on to say that those people are not the less fortunate or members of minority groups who have been traitorous to this nation, but rather those who have had all the benefits that the wealthiest nation on earth has had to offer. They have the finest homes, the finest college education, and the finest jobs in government we can give. This is glaringly true in the State Department. There, the bright young men who are born with silver spoons in their mouth, which means that they're wealthy, are the ones who have been the most traitorous. So the traitors, the ones that are going to cause harm to the United States, are those who are well educated and are wealthy and they have government jobs. Successful people. So what he's really talking about is an us versus them. Okay, it's not us. It's not us in West Virginia who are maybe worried about our futures or are not as economically secure or don't have these fancy jobs or didn't go off to college. It's them. It's those rich, educated people. They're the enemy. And he very much knows what he's doing about making this an us versus them argument and calling out the government and the State Department. Again, he is a Republican and he is talking about a Democratic administration. And so he's playing off a lot of these things. He's also in West Virginia, and we can think about what we know about West Virginia. But then this is the most famous part, this last part that's highlighted. He says that he has in his hand, I need in my hand, a list of 205, a list of names that were known to the Secretary of State as being members of the Communist Party, who nevertheless are still working and shaping policy in the United States. And he holds up this piece of paper. Take a guess what's on that piece of paper. Mine has notes, but his piece of paper is blank. There's nothing on his piece of paper, but he holds it up as if he has evidence, and he's going to hold that as a secret in essentially his entire time that he's going to go on this scheme. All right, so this is February 9th, and then just 2 days later, he is going to send a telegram to the President of the United States. All right, so again, he is a first-term senator who's trying to make a name for himself, and he's writing to the President of the United States. He's a Republican. Truman's a Democrat. And he says, in the Lincoln Day speech, so the one I just read to you, I stated the State Department harbors a nest of communists and communist sympathizers who are helping to shape our foreign policy. I further stated that I have in my possession the names of 57 communists who are in the State Department at present. Wait a second. 57? That seems weird. It is weird. He said 205 just 2 days earlier. But now, when he's talking to the president, he says there are 57. I have a question. Where did 150 communists go? But he's not going to tell us. All right. So he goes on to say that despite the State Department blackout, again, essentially he's not getting information from the State Department, we've been able to compile a list of 57 communists in the State Department. This list is available to you, but you can get a much longer list by ordering Secretary Atkinson to give you a list of those whom your own board listed as being disloyal and who are still working in the State Department. So he essentially says, I have this list of 57, but you can get your own list. He's essentially saying this guy right here, the Secretary Atkinson, is withholding information. So he knows what he's doing. He's playing a game. All right, and then he's going to give this list. He's going to make some demands of the president. And again, he's a first-term senator making demands of the President of the United States, often thought to be the most powerful man in the world. And he says if the president refuses to do what McCarthy is saying, that this will label the whole Democratic Party as the bedfellow of international communism. Certainly, this label is not deserved by the hundreds of thousands of loyal American Democrats throughout the nation, and by the sizable number of able, loyal Democrats in both the Senate and the House. He's essentially blackmailing the president. Do these things or else. Do these things or else all of your followers will be labeled as communists. The person who would be labeling them is McCarthy. So he's absolutely threatening the President of the United States. What do you think the president's going to do? All right. This is actually the telegram that Truman wrote as a response to McCarthy. It never actually gets sent, which I think is pretty admirable, because I think Truman has some willpower that I absolutely did not have. So I'm going to go ahead and read this to you, and I want you to think about why Truman would not have sent it. He says, "My dear Senator, I read your telegram of February 11th from Reno, Nevada with a great deal of interest, as this is the first time in my experience and I was 10 years in the Senate, that I ever heard of a senator trying to discredit his own government before the world. You know that isn't done by honest public officials. Your telegram is not only not true and an insolent approach to the situation that should have been worked out between man and man, but it shows conclusively that you are not even fit to have a hand in the operation of the government of the United States. I am very sure that the people of Wisconsin are extremely sorry that they are represented by a person who has as little sense of responsibility as you have. Thanks. Really what we know is if Truman had sent this telegram, had given more fuel to McCarthy's accusations, that would have made the problem even larger, that he would have gone after Truman even more. And so Truman makes the decision to not add any fuel to McCarthy's craziness or ridiculous witch hunt, which again requires some restraint that I'm not sure that I have, but I think I can appreciate that Truman did. All right, so McCarthyism. So Joseph McCarthy is a person, but they're going to name this after him because of what it is that he does. So this is the practice of making unfair allegations or using unfair investigative techniques, especially in order to restrict dissent or political criticism. Remove myself again. All right, so although the Red Scare started before him, many historians consider Senator Joseph McCarthy to be its personification. So he is the worst of these things. He's the worst of the fear-mongering. He is the worst of the witch hunts, of going after anybody, essentially who is going to criticize him. It's not just about like who might be a communist. It's really about anybody that would stand up against McCarthy or criticize what the government is doing. That any criticism makes them an enemy of McCarthy or the state for them to go after. And again, the fear that already existed in the United States made it very much possible for McCarthy to rise to power or for the creation of McCarthyism. All right, I'm going to move myself again. Okay, so we know already that he changed his facts a whole bunch of times. Okay, he never had any proof. It's always a blank piece of paper. He never reveals anybody that is supposedly on his list. And this has real consequences. I mentioned the Hollywood blacklist that really comes before this, but we also see a mass exodus of government employees because they're being investigated, because there are all these charges or accusations, they get pushed out of the government. And that's actually really has hardcore consequences. It's going to push out experts. It's going to push out experts that know a lot about China or about Russia or other places. And so we don't have experts to know about our enemies. And so if you've ever played sports, it's like you destroyed all of the tapes of your opponents. So you can't learn what they do or how to strategize against them. And this kind of mass exodus of career government employees or experts is something that we see at this time in the 1950s under McCarthyism. But it's actually something that we've seen a lot in the current administration, where lots of long-term government officials or experts have been pushed out in this kind of era of fear-mongering or essentially that we've gotten rid of lots of experts. And that has consequences. You don't have the tools that you need to solve problems or to deal with things or people or countries that you think are your enemies. He's also going to go after, meaning McCarthy, it's going to go after George Marshall, who is part of the army. And by now, Truman has left office and Eisenhower is in office. And Eisenhower is a Republican, so the same political party as McCarthy. And so he too is not privately going to go after McCarthy, but privately, just like Truman, absolutely despises McCarthy. But McCarthy's going to go after the army. And this is when McCarthy essentially takes it too far. So he's going to charge that there are lots of communists within the army and that they are being soft on communism. Again, they just fought in Korea. They've just been tested, and this is too much for people. It's also a live hearing, and so people are watching McCarthy start to unravel on live TV. McCarthy is also an alcoholic, and so he's drinking during the trial, and you can see him. He's disheveled, he's sweating, he's a mess, and it goes terribly. And one of the most famous lines of that is the Army's counsel says, "Until this moment, Senator, I think I never really gauged your cruelty or your recklessness. Have you no sense of decency, sir, at long last?" This famous thing about decency, that you would even go after the army, that your claims and your accusations would even get that large. So the Senate is going to strip him of his leadership role in something called censure. So he doesn't get removed from the Senate, but he loses his power. And he will ultimately die a couple years later in 1957. He essentially drinks himself to death. It's kind of the end of McCarthy. While his tenure is very short, his damage is quite large. All right, this is just one of the guys that he goes after. And this is the Secretary of State. And you heard him talking about the State Department a whole lot. He's just a big deal because he's Secretary of State, but he is instrumental in the creation of the Truman Doctrine. So again, how Truman is trying to contain communism, the Marshall Plan, so those resources for Europe, and some other things. And he's really famous to being loyal to his subordinates or the people that work for him in the State Department, including to Alger Hiss, who he did not think was a spy. And again, at that moment, we don't have clear evidence to show that he's a spy, although now we know he pretty much is. And people, particularly the Republicans that are in charge of Congress at this moment, are really going to criticize him, saying, he's not being tough on communism, he's allowing communism to grow. And we can talk about whether it is really up to the United States to tell a country whether they can be communist or not, but people are going to accuse him of not being tough enough. All right, so these are some political cartoons that I love. I don't know where to put myself. There we go. Okay, and they're important because this is actually where that term McCarthyism is going to come from. So these cartoons are done by a person named Herbert Bloch, or Herb Bloch is how he often comes up with. He is one of two super famous cartoonists in American history. He'll be famous for these as well as some ones about Nixon in one of our later units. All right, so this guy right here. Hopefully you are recognizing that this is the Statue of Liberty right here. And then you have this guy, and he's labeled as hysteria. So that fear-mongering, that craziness that's happening in the country at that moment. And he's yelling fire. And so he's rushing up this ladder to put out the fire of the Statue of Liberty. And so we know that the Statue of Liberty is supposed to stand for American ideals of freedom and democracy and liberty and all those sort of things. And in this fear-mongering or in this scary era, we are so afraid of these things that we are willing to get rid of our ideals. What's hard? And so you can see this just like overreaction in the United States and the consequences what that would be. All right, so this one right here. So you see this, like all these paint buckets and this thing that is labeled as McCarthyism. And you can see this is not stable at all. So you have these guys right here, and they're trying to push this elephant. And the elephant is supposed to represent the GOP, Grand Old Party, or the Republican Party. And you can tell they're trying to put him up here. And says, you mean I'm supposed to stand on that? So essentially saying if the Republican Party falls in line and goes with what McCarthy is doing, that is going to lead to their downfall, because there's no way that this elephant can stand on this idea. And this is an interesting one if we go back and think about what McCarthy says to Truman. McCarthy essentially says, if you don't do what I tell you, the entire Democratic Party is going to fall. And so this is a similar thing of connecting these people to their party. And if these, depending on where your loyalty is, that is going to have consequences. All right, then there's this lady, and if you've done your journals or your energizers, you saw her. But I think she is a pretty cool lady. So she is one of the first, if not the first, female senators in American history. And she actually takes over from her husband who dies. And you can see kind of those tactics. She gets the nickname Moscow Maggie because she is going to criticize McCarthy. She's one of the few people that criticizes is willing to do that, which I think makes her very, very brave. She's also a really cool lady because she was one of the first women to ever run for president of the United States, which I think is pretty dang cool. Not only is she willing to go after McCarthy because he deserves it, his tactics are un-American and are definitely going against our ideas of freedom and democracy. But also that this woman in the 1950s is running for president of the United States. So there's this pretty cool podcast about her if you were interested in the subject. All right, and of course, she is not a communist. All right, Just one option here. There's this film called Good Night and Good Luck. One of the other brave souls that goes after McCarthy is a journalist who is named Edward R. Murrow. And there's a movie about him, and it has George Clooney in it. So if that's your jam, there you go. Let me see. How are we doing on time? I don't know. Oh, we're definitely done for the day. I'm going to go ahead and stop there. And we'll pick up with the Lavender Scare next time. All right. Bye, guys.